Welcome to the Storypowers Podcast, the show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is Jessica Breitenfeld. Jessica uses adaptability intelligence and gestalt principles to build communities, both in the real and in the virtual world. And she uses her clown and improv energy to teach connection at large organizations such as the Damm Group, CaixaBank and Coca-Cola. Jessica is full of stories, including how she traveled for 12 years through 30 countries to fix a broken back. I had lots of fun today. If you do too, please leave us an iTunes review. If you don't, just leave us a bad review. But please, make it funny. I'll take a laugh over a compliment any day. Ladies and gentlemen, Jessica Breitenfeld. Jessica, welcome to the show. Good to have you here.
Thanks. It's super great to be here.
So let me just start with the elephant in the room, which is this story about your back. So explain to me how one travels for 12 years through 30 countries to fix a broken back. And also, how do you do that with a broken back?
So, as dramatic as it sounds, I want you to imagine that you're a young girl, Francisco, and a young girl that has the Hollywood dream of 2 children, a car, and a picket fence. And that dream is taken from you when you're way too tall at age 12 and you fall playing basketball. And a little tiny bone breaks in your back. And 90% of people have no pain with that little breakage. And I was one of those kids who got chronic 24/7 pain in my lower back. And I ignored it and I played basketball. I kept playing basketball. I ignored the chiropractors. They told me to stop exercising, stop moving, and take painkillers. And at around age 26, I said, well, actually my boyfriend said, if you want to get better, you need to go fix this. And so that started my journey around the world, trying to find someone who believed in non-Western medicine, who thinks that they can fix something that the West told me is unfixable.
Okay. So before you started really trying to fix it, or at least not doing things that the doctors were telling you were perhaps stupid, that was a whole 14 years, from 12 to 26.
Yeah, I never realized that, but it was a long time just ignoring it.
Okay. And then, I mean, the 30 countries is probably, we would spend all day just talking about that. But you did fix it, didn't you?
Well, the story continues as I got it fixed a couple times. And the most interesting thing is when I went to do Vipassana, a 10-day Buddhist meditation. Okay. Day 1, 100% of my pain disappeared. From 100% chronic pain for 15 years of my life to 0. And then, as soon as though I was a Buddhist, 10 days later, the pain came back to the exact same level previous. And that gave me a little hint, that gave me a big hint that it has to do with how I'm feeling in my mind and my emotions. So it is a psychosomatic back pain. Although something's broken, it can go away. And so that inspired me to go to places where anything is possible, like Brazil in the jungle, and India in the mountains, and Egypt in the pyramids.
Well, your experience with meditation and back pain seems the polar opposite of mine. As soon as I sit down to meditate, every little bit of my body that is not hurting starts hurting. So I fully agree that is psychosomatic as well, but perhaps my body is trying to tell me that he doesn't like this meditation thing. Mm-hmm. You've done and still do a lot of very different things. So let me just start by asking one expertise that perhaps has come out of a lot of this traveling, which is how does someone, not just you, but how does someone adapt to a different culture? What are the techniques or the things you need to do to properly and quickly adapt to a different culture?
So adaptability intelligence is one of the emotional intelligence skills that everyone should be learning. And I think it's most important because if you go to a new country and you are angry at the way things are over there, and you don't want to take a siesta at 3:00, then you are just going to be living with conflict and stress, essentially. So the first step to adapting to anyone or anything is listening to it, listen to how you feel, and then accepting. No denying, no repressing, no accusing, just accepting this is the way it is and I don't like it. And third step is to build, to go from there, make a new decision. Don't just live in that anger and that disacceptation or hate.
And do you find, because I know you've done this in international organizations with large multinationals, is this the type of problem that is so out in the open in a large organization that they actually have hire someone to come in and fix it?
No. They don't know they need to adapt. Just
right.
Tell anyone, hey, you need better communication skills. And they go, no, it's their problem. They're not good listeners. That department is not so smart. Yeah. So people often, I myself, don't recognize that we're the ones that need to adjust a little bit and adapt a little bit. So I go in there with different topics. So public speaking or confidence or cultural negotiation. And that is the topic, but beneath it is the method, which, as you know, as a trainer, that's kind of our little secret sometimes. We give them what they need because they don't exactly know it sometimes. They just know what the benefit they want. And we know how to do that, right?
It's one of the biggest challenges of working in communication. And again, perhaps this is a big challenge of working in anything, is that although it's such a essential life skill, almost no one is able to see how crap they are at it. I think it's a bit with like when how well you drive a car, right? You get countries like mine, Brazil, where everybody drives, and you ask someone, are you an average driver? Are you above average or are you below average? Not one person says they're below average.
And Francisco, what are you? What kind of a driver?
I am below average.
Below?
I am
Thank
below
you for your
average,
honesty.
Jessica. I failed my driving test twice, and because I'm below average, it only makes sense that every time we need to get in a car and drive for 3 hours, my wife has to do it because, she is the better driver. So I have to sit next to her, control the music, and read a book because otherwise I would be endangering the family. So that has suited me just fine.
Yes, no meditation, no driving. Life is pretty good there.
And again, you don't realize how terrible you are at these things until someone points it out to you. And I always remember this particular occasion where I was driving with a whole bunch of friends, stupidly too fast in the rain as you do, and then I just pulled the car to the side a bit too fast, and one of my friends said, I noticed you didn't look at your mirrors before you did that. And I said, no, it's okay. I can just about feel when there's a car coming.
No.
So, I think with communication, the same happens. You go into a company or you're speaking to anyone that has to do presentations or communicate for their job. They will always think that it might be the content that is the problem. They won't necessarily think that it is the delivery or anything or their credibility as a communicator. So yeah, I fully understand that how someone knows what they're terrible at to the point that they say that I have to hire a coach or a trainer to fix this particular problem is perhaps one of the biggest challenges of working the type of thing that we work with. So you touched on public speaking a little while back, and I know from knowing you and from your profile that you've done plenty of evaluations of other speakers and you've won awards on it. And how much does that translate to anything you do professionally? I mean, do you notice that the same skills that you use to evaluate a public speaker translate to the normal stuff you do when you go into a company, or at least the feedback techniques, if not the listening techniques?
Yes, it's a great point because what kind of a skill is transferable? And if we have about 3 or 4 minutes in Toastmasters to evaluate someone, good, bad, good, bad, good, 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 bad, 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 you have to also be able to do that in a professional way without hurting people's feelings, but looking like a professional who knows what they're talking about. So when I do public speaking training, I'm very Deutsch. I'm very German and extremely direct in what's going wrong. But I got a little bit of clown in me and a big smile. So I balance it out with that to make myself relatable because nobody will listen to someone that they don't like. So if you go in there just hardcore, this is the way, you're wrong, I'm the expert, no one's going to learn. So I use improvisation skills and make people laugh. And while they're laughing, you tell them, and it would be great if next time you could do this. And it kind of just goes into their subconscious in a gentle way, yet direct to their brain. So it's a good technique.
This is something I don't know how good I was at feedback before I got into the whole public speaking thing. And I remember that when I was in sales, one thing I was always taught to do when I was coaching other people was don't ever tell them anything. Just ask questions until they figure it out. But you don't always have the benefit of doing that. It worked well if someone is well trained on what you're trying to do and you play them a call or you show them a presentation and say, how was that? What could have been better there? If you're trained enough, you can say, oh yes, now I can notice that I was doing this thing wrong or that thing could have been better. But if they're not trained, they could watch the same video 10 times and they're not going to figure out what they perhaps need to improve on. Although it is worth saying that this technique of asking people questions and letting them come up with the answers lends itself to a lot of fun, because when I was managing a large team, I was to invite people into my room to give them good news usually. And I would say, Jessica, why have I asked you in here today? And then you just don't say anything. and then occasionally people don't know and I'm not so sure. And then until one day, one guy says, I was not going to firebomb her house. I was just joking.
Oh my God. And you knew that even before having children. Wow.
Oh, yeah. Well, yes. Yes. The technique with children sounds very good in theory, but they never give you the answers. No. So there's almost no point in trying that sort of thing, at least with a 3-year-old. But what I wanted to ask you with the whole evaluation and feedback thing is, when you go into companies and you see people trying this out, what would you say is the biggest mistake or the biggest thing they get wrong when trying to give feedback to everyone else, in public speaking or otherwise?
The biggest problem that people have when giving feedback would be that they don't see it, as you said, and they're giving advice on very basic things, let's say. And so it almost doesn't merit the time it takes to get feedback, except for emotional. And you're all about telling brutally honest stories and public speaking. And so I try and train them to give evaluation based on how they felt in the audience and the emotional connections with the tone and the projection and the body language, because that's what they're good at. They're humans. They can see that stuff. They might not be able to see what you and I can see from hours and years of Toastmasters, but they can trust their intuition.
It's probably a good idea to just explain to someone who might be listening to this who has no idea who Toastmasters is.
Who doesn't know what Toastmasters is?
Apparently a lot of people. So Toastmasters is the world's largest public speaking organization, and it's full of well-meaning but perhaps slightly mentally adult people.
Like us?
Well, yes, that went without saying. It's obviously a great place to practice public speaking skills and evaluations and all of that, but it's a very different environment than the real world, I would think.
But people don't just clap for you when you say something stupid?
I mean, I keep expecting my wife to clap for me, but it just doesn't seem to be happening. After 14 years together, I think I've given up on it now. But it's interesting that you say that, because it wouldn't have been my first answer to what people get wrong with regards to feedback. I think that the first thing that tends to come to my mind is that people think of what they don't like or what didn't work for them and usually phrase it that way. What they haven't done is go the next step, is just say, I didn't like this because it has this effect. And when you give feedback, that's what you ideally want to try and do, is say, instead of saying you moved around too much, you would say, if you stand still more often, then your movement never becomes distracting and it's easier to pay attention to what you're saying. They would just say, you moved around too much and I got distracted. But you're right. I mean, I think that how people feel from whatever it is, speaking or feedback that your boss is giving you, is significantly more important than a lot of the small technical details. It's just that in some cases, the small technical details are the thing that is causing people to feel in a funny way. But there's only so quickly you can teach anyone these things. I mean, this takes quite a bit of practice, or at least we would say that, given that we've given a lot of time to this thing. But we need to amplify the difficulty of getting good at it. Right. So the other question I had for you was, because you have a whole bunch of unusual job titles, or at least descriptions of what your job is. So one of them that I liked was you are a thought surgeon.
Ooh, yes. A little bit ambiguous, no? Would you like to know?
But yes, that's hence bring it up. Yes.
Okay. I just thought you wanted to say, "Oh, great! How creative! I understand it totally," which means it's not working how I want it to work.
Well, yeah, I can just about guess what you mean, but I've gotten myself in plenty of pickles by guessing what people meant. Hence me asking.
So I've studied gestalt psychotherapy for 3 years, which means I've done 600 hours of group therapy, which means essentially going into your brain and your heart and pulling out every idea you have about life, men, and food, and looking at it, crying about it, laughing about it, and then putting it back in, but a little bit different. So what I help people to do now is to figure out their patterns. Why do they pick the men they do? Why do they pick the kind of jobs they do? And why are they unhappy when they go into a certain kind of party? Is it not their kind of people, but they're too insecure to stand up for what they really want to their partner? Do they keep dating poor guys? This stuff comes from our patterns. And if you don't look at the patterns, you can't figure out who you are. So I'm going to help you open that up.
Okay. Yeah, 600 hours of therapy. I'm not sure it's... it does not sound like the most appealing activity I could ever get.
But what are the benefits? The benefits of the surgery. Happiness.
Well, as you know, I tend to see a lot of the public speaking and writing and all of the stuff that goes along with that as my own personal therapy, at least in the sense of, like a lot of people, I guess, I make more sense of things after I write them down. Mm-hmm. So when I have something that is either bothering me or that I'm thinking about constantly, the act of writing it in a way that is concise and can be explained to other people, and ideally, funny or poignant or whatever I'm going for, I tend to find that doing that and then the practice of it, which involves, constant repetition of that idea, and then presenting the whole thing, for me works in a fairly therapeutic way, because there's so much repetition that it sort of anesthetizes you to whatever pain you are discussing. And there is something cathartic about doing it in front of other people. And I tend to find that obviously it doesn't solve my problems, but it tends to at least get a tiny bit of sense of closure, even if it's a sense of, okay, I know how I feel about this now, and I don't need to revisit that for the time being. Now, I'm not so sure the benefits of the people watching might be perhaps less therapeutic and more just pure entertainment. But
well, I think your therapist is your journal. No, your therapist is your structure. It helps you reframe, rethink about what you thought before, and you come out with a different structure or a different idea. So
yeah, and there is this some slightly artificial thing that is very common to public speaking, not necessarily common to storytelling, which is always trying to find some type of moral of the story, but also sometimes trying to find, something that relates to other people and maybe a call to action of some kind. And I don't actually tend to do that as often if it's a very emotional speech that I'm doing, but it forces me to try and make sense of it in a way that is not just this happened and then this happened and this is how I feel. And again, sometimes you have to stretch the reality slightly to put it in some sort of frame that makes sense to other people. But I found it helpful when I've done that with things that were genuinely things that were in my head all the time. I found that I felt better about it afterwards. So there's that. That's my public speaking therapy.
Public speaking. Well, it's the take-home message, right, Francisco? It's like you want the audience to have one clear message. And if you aren't clear about why you are speaking, why you're passionate about this, the audience leaves going, it was nice, it was funny, I learned about Francisco's wife and his kids, but I don't know what I'm supposed to take away. But if you structure it well and you're clear about what you're going to talk about, that is essentially what therapy does. It helps you get clear on why you do the things you do.
Yeah, there is one other aspect of it which I did talk about that to a reasonable extent in the book, which was I was trying to figure out if I thought there was any value in sharing things where you were very vulnerable without necessarily having a very clear sense of closure or this is the lesson that you should take from it. And my conclusion was that there is value in doing it. And the value is that when you go up in front of 30, 40 people or hundreds of people and you open yourself up that way, what you are showing is, see, it's okay to feel these things. It's okay to be vulnerable. You don't always have to pretend that everything is perfect and everything is great. And even if my situation has nothing at all to do with yours, what I felt when I've seen people do that is, oh, it's all right that I screw up all the time, or it's all right that in this particular area of my life I feel like a failure. It's okay. Nothing terrible is happening. The moment you put that out there, actually it seems to be the opposite. People come to you and go, wow, that was really brave. No one tends to think less of you because you, made yourself look, weak, in inverted commas. It seems to be the opposite, right? So, and I thought this was an incredible insight until someone pointed me to Brené Brown.
Brené Brown.
And yes, and I was like, damn it, someone got there first.
But you're funnier than her, so you got a whole new take on it.
Well, yes. I think that if I introduce myself as the funny Brené Brown, the doors and the wallets will just open.
Or people will just start crying and telling you their story, and you become their therapist.
Yes. And I think that anyone that watches me speak or reads all the nonsense I post on LinkedIn or, knows me will know that I am not really the person that you should be getting life advice from.
No.
You don't need to be so quick to agree to that.
I read your LinkedIn every day and I laugh every day and I enjoy it very much. And no, you inspire me in different ways.
Well, there's that. I'll take what I can get. Right. So following on to the list of perhaps strange things that you have on your description of work, there was a term that I found which was cultural storyselling. So I've come across storyselling before. I've read at least one or two books called Storyselling. But I've never seen that have been put together with the word cultural in any time before. So where does that come from?
Having been to 45 countries, and I didn't speak any of the languages. I had to adapt to them. And so I realized that being able to communicate with the body and the micro movements on the face, so essentially communicating your emotions, are the most important things when speaking in public. Of course, that's what I train in. I train how to speak in public, and for cultures that are very, very different than their colleagues in other countries, they have to be aware of the differences when they're speaking. I guess it's kind of a fancy way to say that there are so many things below the iceberg that you do not realize that you could be doing to offend, distract, or just turn off your audience. And it's cultural. It's not just a human public speaking course. It's about the eye contact. It's about who enters the room first. Who do you address first? If you mention this, if you're too vulnerable, people don't want to do work with you, especially in Japan. There's the high context, low context. And so it becomes a bigger stakes game if you don't understand cultural differences when pitching. I
would imagine that my approach to public speaking in life might not go down a treat in Japan. Yeah, no, I fully see where you're coming from that. It is true. And I think that could be very easily a mistake that we make, which is that we assume that some of these things are universal because, we are all humans. And this is sort of become a buzzword these days, the whole human thing, be more human and whatever. But, there's humans and humans. And as I noticed by the first few trolls I started getting on LinkedIn. Some humans are very different than others. So I think it will be slightly hubristic to assume that just because some things are universal, that culture is not going to have a massive impact and not affect dramatically how you come across to different people, particularly if the culture is a very different one than
I have a
the one
small
you
example.
I
have a small example of cultural story selling, and it just has. Imagine I have some friends in India because I lived there for 7 months, and a lot of these colleagues, they call me a simple girl. And the first couple times I heard it, I was insulted because in Canadian English, if you call someone simple, it's perhaps saying that they have a learning disability or they're just the girl next door that is very boring. And I questioned a few of these guys and they said, no, it means nice, very nice. And I was like, well, how interesting. Now, if they use that word for a simple product in their pitch, it would be completely misunderstood by North Americans and Europeans. They would not know that it was a compliment. And as much as that's language, the language and the culture and the impressions of everything is being subconsciously transmitted to your public. And if you don't know the cultural differences, you could be losing them within the first 7 seconds because you looked or put your hand out or bowed the wrong way.
Yeah, and I guess that if you look at how some things are perceived in even Western cultures, they're drastically different. I mean, for example, I have a very good friend who lives in the Netherlands, and he always goes on about how blunt the Dutch are. And he finds it incredibly amusing because they just have no tolerance for bullshit whatsoever. They'll just tell you to your face whatever they're thinking. And even something simpler than that, like, for example, you look at American work culture, or North American work culture, I should say, and it's just completely different than what it is in Spain, right? You know, just what the Spanish feel about their holidays, it would probably be looked down upon in the United States. Or things like drinking. You know, we both live in Barcelona. It's the most normal thing in the world to have a glass of wine with lunch. And I think in most places of, not even only the United States, but in the UK, if you're having a drink for lunch, people will
better be tea.
No, people think this is why you already started. It was like, no, it's one drink. I don't start and then continue for 7 hours. I have one and I stop. But, again, a very different concept. Perhaps the last thing I want to go in, because I think it will take us a bit, is that, you've lived in all these countries. You have all these stories, and I've heard some of them. And I would imagine that a lot of these stories and these experiences filter into what you do professionally. You will, I would expect, at some point tell some of the stories or use them as examples. That's probably the case, isn't it?
Of course. It's the bread and butter of intriguing.
So my question to you, and because this is something that I find a lot of people deal with this very differently, but how much deliberate thought goes into what story goes with what part, and what parts of which story goes with what part of what you're doing? Or is it more instinctive for you?
Telling a story is very instinctive for me because I have so many disastrous, horrible, lovely, heartbreaking stories from all those travels and all those love stories. And so many of them work in many situations. So I just stand up there and I hear a little voice that goes, tell the one where the guy never called you back and you had moved to the country for him and that's how you learned about Islam. And then I go into the story about Dr. Mustafa.
I don't know. You and I think have a very different approach when it comes to that. We had a conversation a while back, and I said to you that I am terrible at improvisation. And perhaps I'm exaggerating slightly. I'm not terrible compared to perhaps most civilians, but I always find that I can never express myself as well when I improv than when I have time to craft something. And with stories, to me, that's very much the case. So yeah, sometimes something just comes to mind and you just tell it. Like I just told the story about me driving with my friends and sensing when a car was about to hit it. But normally what I tend to do is if I'm going to do a training or if I'm doing a keynote speech or anything of that kind, I always think, okay, well, what message do I want to convey? What's the effect that I'm trying to bring about? What story would work in that context and what parts of that story? Because depending on the context you are in, the tolerance for you telling a story might be a lot higher or lower. If you're in a straight up business environment and no one expects you to be telling stories, sometimes you don't get the benefit of the doubt for 5-6 minutes. So you need to, I feel that you need to get to whatever you're going with that sooner. If it's between friends, you say, listen, I've got this great story. People just refill their drinks and listen. So,
I think you're right. Yes.
Yeah,
and you're making me reflect that, yeah, I do have my 20 stories that I use in the corporate world, and I have my 20 stories that I use with girlfriends sitting around having sangria. You're right. I didn't realize I do exactly what you do. So,
yeah, I've heard an example. I think this was from Matthew Pollard, who's a fairly well-known keynote speaker in Canada, right? And the example he uses is that couples, when you're with someone for a while, there is an origin story. And that origin story is terrible the first time you tell it together, and it starts getting better over time. And then you're like, no, you tell this bit, I'll tell this bit. That part is boring, let's just not tell that part. And then eventually you end up with a crafted story that you think, shows you in the best light possible. And I tend to find that some stories, because of their nature, give themselves to just being told in the most instinctive way possible. And some stories, if you don't craft them a bit, you just end up some rambling tale that never gets anywhere. And I have lots of friends who send us a video, like to the group chat or whatever, and it's them telling a story, and it just goes on for like 7 minutes. It's like, so you wanted to tell me that this happened and then that happened, right? That should have taken 45 seconds.
Interesting, the cultural part of that as well, because direct speech is low context cultural value. And so although you're from Brazil, you now, because you've been in the international world for so long, you appreciate that directness. But tell someone from Barcelona to tell a story and it takes 8 minutes and they repeat it 3 times. And there's nothing wrong with that in that context. But do that to a North American, they're gone. They have no patience for that kind of thing. So storytelling, directness, what to share, amount of vulnerability is really a skill that you need if you want to start doing international business.
Yeah, and I think that you can hardly emphasize that more. I mean, it is a skill. I think it's a skill that people had and kind of lost because it's not typically practiced. It's not something that gets taught pretty much anywhere unless you're specifically studying marketing or presentation skills. And it still baffles me to this day how underused it is, given how obviously it works. Whenever someone tells you a good story that stays with you for so long, and then you go about your day, and the last thing you're thinking about is, I've got this client meeting coming up, what story should I tell? It's just not, it's been drummed out of our natural way of speaking so much that it even sounds weird to say to someone, this client meeting, what story are you telling? They'll just look at you like you're insane. I
have a colleague who does narrative storytelling, and he just told me that he doesn't sell storytelling. What he calls it is, narrative, but what he calls it and is very successful in Germany is moments. Tell me your moment or your experience. And that way people don't tell you a 6-minute story about what they ate for lunch. They really just tell you a moment. I felt unhappy because, again, I chose the pizza when I know I'm on a diet and I should lose 5 pounds, and I'm a little disappointed in myself. And there you go. You have it quicker because it's just a moment. So maybe it's even the language of storytelling that intimidates people. Perhaps we can simplify the language for people so that we are more apt to sharing our experiences and our feelings, which is the heart of a good story anyway. The reactions, right?
Yeah, and I think that what your friend is doing, I've seen other people do. For example, the way I've explained to some people stories, what makes up a story is before things were normal, something happened, and after things were different, right? So you just need to tell me enough about the before so I know what the baseline is. Then tell me what brought about the change, and then tell me how things were different afterwards. And I've seen Kindra Hall, for example, who is a top keynote speaker on storytelling. She calls one of her elements of a story is the moment. And she says, that moment, that's where you want all the richness of detail. And, that moment when the thing happened is the one thing that the story revolves around. And the rest just needs to be enough so that you can see the contrast. And I think if you're using storytelling in advertising, then it has to be that sort of super condensed format, because all you're showing is someone who's upset, and maybe they saw a product and now they're happy. Right? It's the crudest form of a story, but it's still using the same principles. But even so, I think it's just how little we do it as a matter of fact is something that, again, it's good that it's not more obvious, because perhaps I'll have less of a job if everybody knew how to do it and was doing it well. But
well, you know what you have, Francisco? I'm just thinking that there's a talent that you have, which is your humor. And if all you have to do is show the beginning and then where the change happened, you could use the rule of 3 for the humor, right? So sad, lonely, eating donuts. And then I took Francisco's course, or I went on Tinder and I became sexually fulfilled, lost weight, and eat only carrots. Ba-bong. You could do it really short and concise and add humor. I think I might start doing that.
Yes, I had 2 or 3 jokes about the sexually fulfilled, but I don't think I'm going to touch that just now.
You're not going to touch that, huh? Can't touch that.
On that note, I think this was fantastic, Jessica. Thank you very much for your time today. And if people want to find you, what's the best place to do so?
Find me in Canada, in the woods, where I'm hiding out from COVID, or on LinkedIn. It might be a little bit easier.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Stay safe. For the time being, stay home. And until next time.